In Revelation 1:8, Jesus describes himself as the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, and Omega is the last letter. These two letters illustrate that Jesus is the first and the last. History exists for him, and history is going to end just as he has determined. This title of Jesus being the Alpha and the Omega is also a really great place to start when we consider the Greek alphabet. So when Jesus says, I am the Alpha and Omega, he was speaking in Greek, presumably, because the Apostle John recorded this in Greek for us. And when we look at the whole Greek alphabet, we can see that it begins with the Alpha and it ends with the Omega. What I'd like to do is go through the Greek alphabet. I'll just walk through these letters, and then we're going to practice so you can see how I like to write each letter. Of course, the alphabet starts with alpha, and then we've got beta, and then there's gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, psi, omicron, pi, rho. Now, rho is one of those letters that looks like one of our English letters. It looks like the P, but be careful because it's not the P sound, it's the R sound. And after the rho, we have sigma. There's actually two sigmas. This sigma is how you'll see sigma when it's at the beginning of a word or in the middle of a word, or even towards the end of a word. But when sigma is the very last letter of a word, it's going to be written that way. And then we have tau, upsilon, phi, he. Now, he kind of has a CH sound, maybe a little bit of an H sound as well. It's kind of like a he. And then we've got psi, which is cool, looks like a pitchfork, right? And then the last letter is the omega. Let's go ahead and practice these letters. So the alpha, I like to begin like this towards the top and then come around and make that little curl at the end. The beta, I usually start towards the bottom and come up like that to form a beta. The gamma is like this. The delta, I usually start at the top and then come around and make the circle. After that, we have an epsilon, which is a lot like our E, and it kind of looks like a capital E, right? It's just a little bit smaller. The zeta, I usually start at the top with the curl and then come around like that through the bottom of the line. Eta looks like our N, but it comes a little below the line, and it doesn't have an N sound, it has more of an E sound. Theta is always a fun letter to draw, for me at least. Next we have the iota, which is the equivalent of our I. The kappa has that K sound, and it looks like our K as well. And then we've got lambda. That's the L sound. After lambda, we have the mu, which is the M sound. And then we have the nu, which looks like V, but it actually has an N sound. Next, we have the xi. I also like to start this one at the top and then come down through the line with that big curl at the bottom. This is pretty similar to the zeta. Remember the zeta over here? All right, well, the xi is different because it has another point in the middle, which makes it look a little more like our E. The first letter, the zeta over here, has that Z sound, whereas this xi has more of the X sound. It's easy to confuse these two, so be careful with the zeta and with the xi. Next, we have omicron, which is like our O, and it basically is the sound equivalent of our O. Then we have P. P is famous because it's often used in algebra, right? After P comes the rho. And then we have sigma. Sigma is kind of like our cursive S. Most of the time we're going to see that form. But again, when sigma ends a word, it's going to be written like this. And that bottom curl just comes a little bit below the line. Okay, let's go to the second line here. Tau is just like a T. And again, these are all lowercase letters. The original Greek manuscripts were written in all capitals. Really, ever since the 4th century, 4th to 5th century, most manuscripts have the smaller case. And certainly today, the editions of the Greek New Testament are all going to be written in lowercase letters. So for our purposes, it's more important that we recognize the lowercase Greek letters. And after tau, we have the upsilon, like our U. What's interesting about upsilon, as we'll see in a minute, it has more of an E sound in Greek. We'd expect it to have an U sound, but actually has more of an E sound. And then we have phi, which is basically the equivalent of our F in English. And then we have ki, which is that CH or H sound. And then we have that pitchfork-looking letter, which is the psi, followed by the last letter of the Greek alphabet, which is the omega. So in English, we have 5 vowels, right? Can you remember the 5 vowels of English? I'll write them over here. We've got A, E, I, O, and U. You might notice something similar about the vowels of Greek. They're basically the same letters, right? And these letters happen to look just like our English equivalents. But instead of A, E, I, O, and U, we have the alpha, and then we have the epsilon, the iota, the omicron, and then the upsilon. But Greek has 2 more vowels. The eta, usually when we see it in a word, it's going to have more of an E sound, but it's called the eta. And then we have the omega as well. The omega usually has the sound equivalent of the omicron. Let's talk about a few rules of pronunciation. And this is just to introduce the concepts. And then we're going to look into these rules in a little bit more detail when we listen to a native Greek speaker read through Revelation 1, verses 8 and 9. First of all, we have the reality of diphthongs. A diphthong is just 2 vowels that are placed together that have 1 vowel sound. We can look at the example of ude. So this word ude, which means and not, neither, or nor, begins with 2 vowels, the omicron and the upsilon. Pronounced separately, we'd have o, e, but together they make the sound of u. So it's 2 vowels with 1 vowel sound. That's what a diphthong is. And we're going to see plenty of diphthongs in Greek. Another thing to keep in mind when we start our process of reading and recognizing Greek is the iota subscript. The iota subscript is the letter iota that is subscripted underneath a lengthened vowel. So the vowel will usually be an eta, sometimes it's an alpha, it could be an omega as well. You don't hear the iota in pronunciation, but the iota is important because it affects meaning and interpretation. We won't talk in any detail right now about the iota subscript, but it is good for you now to realize that this exists. Another thing that we'll see frequently is the breathing mark. The breathing mark is used with words that begin with a vowel. So if we see a word like apostolos, you can notice that the breathing mark is shifted that way to the right. When it's pointing to the right like that, it's called the smooth breathing mark, and there's no sound. It's a silent breathing mark. You just say apostolos. But there's also the breathing mark called the rough breathing mark, as in the word chorao, and you can hear a little bit of that H sound, right? The rough breathing mark means that there's an H sound at the beginning of the pronunciation of the word. Syllabification is also something we want to keep in mind. I believe it's of secondary importance, but as we're going to be seeing a bunch of words that we're not familiar with, it might be helpful to keep in mind how the sounds are related. The most basic rule for syllabification is that generally a syllable ends in a vowel sound, or there's 1 vowel sound per syllable. So if we take a word like akekamen, which means we have heard, we would divide it up like this. It would be a, ke, ka, a, men. Usually the syllables end with a vowel sound, but as we can see with the last syllable, they don't always end with a vowel sound. Sometimes the consonant needs to go with what goes before. And so we just pronounce men altogether. If we look at a word like arkis, we notice that in the middle, the ro and the ki are 2 letters that aren't easily pronounced together, urki. When that happens, they're generally divided. And so this word, arkis, would have 2 syllables, and it'd be divided right in between those 2 consonants that are not easily pronounced together. We'd have arkis. And then we have another example, etheasametha. This would be broken apart like this. We'd have the the, a, sa, me, tha. Again, we see that basic rule that the syllables generally end with a vowel. But maybe it's a surprise to see that this epsilon alpha right there are not actually a diphthong. In English, when we have ea, as in the word each, that forms a diphthong and it's pronounced together. But when we have epsilon and alpha in Greek, these are not pronounced together, and so it has the sound of etheasa metha, for instance. So the idea of this video is just to introduce the alphabet and some characteristics of pronunciation. Perhaps something that will be really helpful is just to listen to a native Greek speaker read through Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, where Jesus says, "I'm the Alpha and the Omega." And since there's some really good examples of how the alphabet works in the following verse, in verse 9, we're going to listen to both. But we're going to start with verse 8. So here's what Revelation chapter 1 verse 8 looks like in the Greek. The reader of this verse is going to be Spiros Zodiatis. He was a Bible scholar who was from Greece, and he uses modern Greek pronunciation in his reading of the New Testament. Recent studies have shown that Koine Greek, or Biblical Greek, Greek from the first century, most likely sounded like modern Greek today. Let's pay close attention and see if we can follow him.
Εγώ είμαι το Α και το Ωμέγα, λέγει Κύριος ο Θεός, ο Ων και ο Ιν και ο Ερχόμενος, ο Παντοκράτορ.
Okay, how did that go for you? Why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and listen to it one more time, and then I want to highlight a few of the sounds. Here we go.
Εγώ είμαι το Α και το Ωμέγα, λέγει Κύριος ο Θεός, ο Ων και ο Ιν και ο Ερχόμενος, ο Παντοκράτορ.
So what did you notice? Maybe you noticed that some of the diphthongs don't have the equivalent sounds in English. For instance, he said ego, me, right? So the e there, which we might think is a, for instance, like in the word 8, the number 8, it actually has more of an e sound. So that's interesting. Another diphthong right here, in a word that's very common in the New Testament that means and, instead of being pronounced I, as we might expect, it was pronounced e, right? So the word is pronounced ke. We already mentioned how the epsilon iota is pronounced e, so this verb would be legi. We also notice this in the word kyrios. We might expect it to be kurios, right? Because the upsilon looks like our u, but it actually has more of a pronunciation of e, as in kyrios. In the verb in, again, this is an eta right here, but it has more of an e sound. While we're noting some of the things that are different, keep in mind that most of these sounds are exactly what we would expect. And with the letters that look like our English letters, there's a lot of really convenient overlap. All right, so let's go ahead and listen to verse 9.
Εγώ, Ιωάννης, ο αδελφός ημών και συγκοινωνός εν τη θλίψη και βασιλεία και υπομονή εν Ιησού, εγενόμην εν την ίσο τη καλουμένη Πάτμο, δια των λόγων του Θεού και την μαρτυρίαν Ιησού.
So you might have noticed more things than I noticed, but I'm going to point out a few things that I noticed. One thing that's kind of interesting, the name that means John, Ioannis, notice how it starts with 3 vowels right there. They're the sounds I, O, A, all crunched together, Ioannis. In the word imon, which means your, as in your brother, adelphos means brother, again we're reminded that that upsilon has more of an E sound. Did you notice how he pronounced this gamma right here in the word sunkinonos? He actually gave this gamma more of an N sound. And that's because gamma is a guttural letter. And when there's a guttural letter right in front of another guttural letter, it takes an N sound to clarify for the listeners that there's actually 2 guttural letters in succession. Another interesting thing is this diphthong right here. The omicron and iota together we might think has that oi sound, right, as it would in English. But actually in Greek it has more of an E sound. So this word is sunkinonos. Thlipsi, there we see that fun letter, the psi, right, that looks like a pitchfork. And the diphthong is E, again that has more of an E sound, not an A like we might expect in English. Here in the word basileia, we see 3 vowels in succession. The first 2 are a diphthong E, and then it's followed by alpha, so it's basileia. Here's the upsilon that has more of that E sound. And then the name Jesus, Iisu. Did you notice that? It's the iota, so it has that E sound, and then the eta also has that E sound, and it's pronounced isu. Here we have a participle, which is translated called. It's the island which is called Patmos, and the Omicron upsilon has that U sound just as we would expect in English. I almost forgot to mention that we also see the iota subscript in verse 9. Right here, towards the end of the first line in the word T, there we see the iota subscript. T is the article that's modifying the word thlipsi and also the word that means kingdom, basileia. In the word basileia, the iota subscripted, as normally happens when the iota follows an alpha. Take a look at the iota with which the word thlipse ends. Both of these words, thlipse and basileia, are in the dative case. That's why they have the iota. They're in the dative case. They're the object of the preposition en, but in the word thlipse, the iota didn't subscript. Same is true for the word patience, hupamoni. Right there, we see the iota subscript, right? That's because all of these nouns are objects of a preposition and they're in the dative case. And then when he says that he was in the island, which is called Patmos right there, notice that the whole expression basically has iota subscripts. You see all of those? Even all the way to the word Patmos. The modifiers agree with the word they're modifying in case, number, and gender. So like I said earlier, the iota may not be heard in pronunciation, but it is important for interpretation and for meaning. There's probably other things we could note, but these are just a few of the differences that are good to keep in mind as we get started in our study of this fascinating language.